The question we all should be asking is why the ZTK-990 simulation counted Lieutenant Wyatt Staples' actions as a victory. Does anyone at all have an inkling that that was even an option? Commander Lukacs Ishtal asked, but found no answer as he eyed his fellow commanders. Sitting around a table, the 8 available head commanders remained silent while the video recording of Wyatt's performance replayed on their personal monitor displays for the 8th time. Juliana Winfield smirked when the impossible message of victory appeared on her screen and relaxed on her comfortable seat. She eyed the rest of the commanders present. To her left and going in a clockwise pattern was Redford Kalen, a good friend and her mentor. He was silent, but she knew he was beyond perplexed. Then came the hoity-toity and smug red-haired William Hempstroke. His expression was, for once, unreadable, and it caused her no small amount of amusement. Then came the robust, strong, black-haired Hannah Tallereau. Lukacs Ishtal was next, while the remaining 3 commanders, the old, seasoned, and insufferable George Lintar, the brown-haired and scarred Frederick Anderson, and the stick-up-her-ass, bald Vivian Tiravis. "That should be flagged as treason," George Lintar said, frowning. "For a commoner pilot to even think of attacking his superiors? How do we know he won't betray us at some point for convenience?" "And yet, the simulation counted it as a victory," Juliana replied. "We all know the unwinnable scenarios, no matter the branch of the military, are a large mystery even to us. We should be praising Wyatt Staples for his outside-the-box thinking. I am aware that that's the reason you managed to escape the Black Ship's assault in the first place, Redford." "Indeed it is," Redford replied, impassive and stoic. He tossed a compost container at the ship as a mine of sorts. A trash container turned into ordnance. Never would have believed it before that day. I'm certain that the ship's crew was as baffled as I was when I first heard of what he did. But to achieve this, I am confused. It took me over 50 attempts to figure out how to beat that simulation when I was just a lieutenant commander. We all know that the K-990 simulations and how to beat them are a closely guarded secret and that we cannot share how to obtain victory. Many have more than one possible solution. And yet, Vivian Tiravis hummed deeply, frowning, arms crossed. Who would have thought that ZTK-990 would have another way to be solved? And many have seen it. Keeping it a secret will be difficult. Knowing Princess Clara, she'll try to not only keep a recording of it for herself, something I'm certain she's already acquired, but spread it at some point or another. The prince himself will have to talk to her, Juliana replied, and all commanders agreed with a nod or a soft grumble. Speaking of that, Redford, how are the other pilots taking it? Hannah Tallereau asked as she turned her attention to Redford. It is a mixed response. In these past 2 days, Wyatt has received as much admiration as scorn, Redford replied. Frederick rolled his eyes. Let me guess. The nobles scorn him while his fellow commoner rabble praises his deeds. Are they seeing him as a figure to emulate? Like I said, it is a mixed response, Redford replied once more. Sensing that his fellow commanders wouldn't drop the subject unless he fessed up, he sighed. Both sides scorn him and praise him for different reasons. Some commoners outright detest him. Apparently, they believe he is lording himself over them due to His Majesty's direct praise and acknowledgement in the form of his new rank. The nobles that wish to bring ridicule on him are those he directly defeated in the tournament, except for one, and those that see him as an upstart. In both groups, however, are those who judge him for his ability and show limited support. And Wyatt Staples himself? How is he behaving after his victory? Lukacs asked, curiously. Redford smirked. After he fainted, he was brought to medical and woke up an hour later. At first, he believed it was all a dream, but when he saw his score and the recording, he went silent. The impression of actually winning overpowered him. He is not a man used to being praised, nor do I believe he thinks too highly of himself. He is humble, yet he knows he's an outstanding pilot. Do you think he could become an ace? William asked, intrigued. After his display in the simulations, I do not know. Redford leaned forth. His attitude is paradoxical to me. He is eager and confident enough to enter combat, yet seeks no personal glory. He is more than capable of following protocol, order, and maneuvers, yet he is ingenious, inventive, and thinks outside the box. He is a loyal pilot and soldier, yet will do anything in his hands to win and survive. Truth be told, I think we may have the makings of a new lone wolf within our ranks. "You must surely be joking, Redford," George proclaimed, while William and Frederick nodded in agreement. "A commoner cannot be a lone wolf. He lacks the training and the connections necessary to be one. Commoners serve, and nobles lead. That has always been the fundamental cornerstone of the principality. And yet, there have been exceptional commoners who have risen to a noble status, minor or grand, inconsequential or impactful it has happened," Vivian replied, eyes wandering to Redford. "House Kalin is one such an example, and no one doubts it's more than 1,000 years of noble bloodline, correct?" "True, but the sheer thought that a garbage hauler and a lowly pilot could achieve such a status." "Preposterous," George countered. "I won't object to the decision of the prince, but Wyatt Staples is a wild card that we know little about. Until we know where his loyalty lies, we should take measures to ensure he won't outshine those of purer blood again, or remove him if he becomes a threat." "I agree, but only after a thorough investigation we will decide what we shall do," Juliana remarked. "Redford, I trust that you, as commander of the fighter division, will know how to best use Wyatt's abilities." "I do, and it is another point of difficulty for me. He doesn't have any sort of training in commanding roles at all. He can lead a squadron of fighters easily, but anything beyond that is out of his current capabilities. I'm certain he will learn. The fourth simulation proved he can make measured, level-headed decisions. Losing a pilot with his innate talent would be wasteful." Crossing his arms, he leaned back. "As to ZTK 990's dilemma, I believe I have a theory. Wyatt's actions, I insist, should be flagged for potential treason at the very least. There was no honor in his actions," George began but was cut off by Vivian. "And yet he uncovered a second path to victory none of us knew about. Even the prince was surprised." "What is your theory, Redford?" she asked, glaring at the oldest commander in the room. "Each unwinnable scenario has a nickname. For example, GVK 990 is known as Beyond Fury, BPK 990 is the infamous Murder House, and ZTK 990 is Honor in Death. Think about that nickname, Honor in Death. What does honor imply? Is it even the point of the simulation? The only command given is to die with honor, but how to achieve it? A mere suicide doesn't cut it. Fighting back is pointless, or so we thought, and proving your loyalty beyond doubt was the only viable solution." "You're dancing around the subject, Redford. What is it that you're trying to say?" Lukacs asked impatiently. Juliana processed what her old mentor had said, and as she stared at the still screen, a realization dawned on her. "Well, I'll be. That was an option all along." All eyes turned to her, Redford's dull gray irises beaming with pride. "The objective is to die with honor, right? You can either accept your death and be granted that honor, or fight against overwhelming odds and still win somehow, keeping your honor intact. If that were to happen in real life, Wyatt would die in his ejected cockpit in a few hours, but he'd die on his terms with a smile on his face, knowing he stuck it up fate's ass." "Barbaric," Frederick muttered with disgust. "This is precisely why I rolled out of the Navy. Uncultured brutes such as Wyatt are such a detriment, a blemish that shouldn't be allowed to pollute the honorable ranks of the military in any way. The Army knows about true diligence and honor." Juliana wanted to roll her eyes at Frederick's response. Being the highest-ranked noble in the room, his entitlement was more than palpable. Suddenly, they all received the same message directly into their brains. "Arrival at Gintrax successful. All personnel, report to your stations." "It seems our reunion will have to be concluded earlier than expected," Redford said as all 8 commanders stood up at the same time. "Juliana, a word if you will?" Juliana gave her mentor a curt nod and waited until the rest left the room. Once their privacy was ensured, she asked with a raised eyebrow, "What is it, Redford?" "I've received reports that state Cynthia has been training with Wyatt. Have you authorized this?" he asked gently. Juliana was momentarily stunned, then chuckled full of mirth. "No, I didn't. I'm sure Clara has something to do with it. What sort of training is my sister giving your new star pilot, Redford?" "Hand-to-hand combat, marksman practice, and endurance training so he can get used to the kinetor implant." He paused, frowning. "What they did to him is unacceptable. I must thank Cynthia for filing a complaint herself." Juliana nodded. And you took a gamble by vouching for him to get those implants, Redford. It seems it paid off. Another chuckle escaped her lips. How is my sister treating the budding lieutenant? Don't tell me he is also a prodigy in those fields. Redford laughed. If defeat is a learning experience, then Wyatt has been receiving an intense data stream upload these past 2 days. Cynthia shows him no mercy. Juliana smirked widely. As it should be. Again? Cynthia ordered as she stood over the panting man that was Wyatt Staples. Give me a moment, please, Wyatt begged and was not ashamed to do so. His lungs burned, his muscles were sore, and he was sure he'd sprained muscles he didn't know he had before. 2 days. 2 days of this torture. Training. This isn't training. This is agony, Wyatt thought as his chest heaved with exertion. After his surprising victory and everything that brought with it, he found himself being metaphorically dragged by the blue-haired woman to the gym area. There, she proceeded to teach him several warm-up routines that he found satisfying despite not focusing on his physical training all that much. Then, the terror began. She was a predatory bird watching him obey her commands, push-ups, sit-ups, weightlifting, treadmill running, focused breathing, and more just to test his endurance. It was the amount and the speed at which she wanted her orders fulfilled that were a torment to meet, and worst of all, every mistake was met by a thwack of her rod that hurt like hell, but left no bruises behind. After the endurance training, she wanted to test his hand-to-hand skills, of which he had none. He was never good at fighting with his fists. Martial arts were puzzling at best, and anything more elaborate than throwing a punch, kicking something, or headbutting was beyond his capabilities. As a result, Cynthia handed him his ass every time. Their first duel ended before he knew what had happened. It wasn't particularly fair either, as she never took off her armor, and he was forced to do everything in training shorts, a tank top, and sports shoes. My only saving grace is my skill with the rifle, he thought as he struggled to stand up, knowing he'd be back down before long. He wasn't a particularly good shot, but he wasn't terrible either. He was no marksman or sniper, but he knew how to shoot a gun. Shaking his head, he stood up to shaky feet. He then brought his arms up, his hands curled into fists, taking a defensive stance. Cynthia sighed. Your posture is horrible. Part your feet more, lower your back, and take a firmer stance. Did you learn nothing about combat in the academy? Obeying her commands as best he could, he replied, I was never fond of using my fists to fight. Using something like a plasma cutter, a sword, axe, or any sort of melee weapon only endangers me and those around me. I can still throw grenades and use firearms as you've seen, Cynthia, he replied. Why does this matter anyway? What if you're challenged to a duel, Wyatt, or you don't have a gun in the middle of a fight? You may be a fighter pilot first and foremost, but you are still a pilot, and you may be required to fly other vessels. You need to be prepared, she said, relaxing her posture, and so far I'm not impressed. Now come at me. Challenge to a duel? Why would I ever accept that? I'm not a noble, and even if I was, I would never accept a duel. I'd just shoot the guy and be done with it. And if I don't have a gun, I'll run away or hide, he thought tiredly. He was grateful to Cynthia for teaching him how to endure the pain and discomfort the implants put him through. More than that, she was a noble that he could respect. But she was still a noble, and, like a noble, honor, pride, and ego were great concerns to her. With a deep breath and a slow exhale, he lunged forth, throwing a punch at her face that she easily dodged. Moving quickly, he stepped to the side and delivered a second punch to the side. He'd been beaten over 100 times in 2 days, and he'd learned some of her moves. Not that it did any good, and she simply blocked his fist, grabbed his wrist, and the next second he was on the air before hitting the mat with his back again. Gah! He cried out and gasped for air. You lasted half a second longer this time, Wyatt. Get up! Again! Cynthia commanded. Wyatt wasn't sure if she'd praised him or insulted him, but that didn't matter. He stood up, ready to kiss the floor again. Suddenly, all activity in the room ceased, and the two of them froze as they received a message through the ship's AI. Enemy ships detected. All personnel report to battle stations. This is not a simulacrum. All personnel report to battle stations. Then, before he could do anything about it, Wyatt got a second message coming from Redford. Lieutenant Wyatt, report to the launch bay immediately. Gear up and be ready for deployment. Nothing else followed. Wyatt and Cynthia exchanged a look and nodded. They ran in different directions to fulfill their duties.